Hello and welcome to the program. Since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, after 4 years of war in eastern Ukraine, Russia yet took another step by attacking Ukrainian vessels in the Azov Sea. It is a new step for a full-scale war and how to tackle Russia's hostile behavior in the region. Joining me today to expand on this topic is Brian Whitmore. He's a senior fellow and director at the Central for European Policy Analysis. He's also the author of the popular blog Power Vertical. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
These last days, hot topic, the Azov Sea. Now the Russian attack on the Ukrainian vessels in the Azov Sea, Russia has been building up its presence since the beginning of 2018. Why attacking Ukrainian vessels now?
Well, I think it's very clear that Russia is trying to annex the Sea of Azov. I mean, it successfully, illegally, but successfully de facto annexed the Crimean Peninsula because nobody challenged it. And now they're pushing to the next step, and that is annexing the Sea of Azov, which is international waters, and which, as I don't need to tell you, would cut off southeastern Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, and I would argue severely undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. If you're cutting off the southeastern portion of the country to its maritime access, you really are undermining Ukraine's sovereignty, and I think this is something that we all have to be aware of, but we also have to be aware of that this is not just about Ukraine. The Sea of Azov is international waters, and if we are going to allow Russia to annex that, and we are doing so until we challenge it one way or the other, then this should concern all of us. This is important for Black Sea security, for example. This is important for the right of free navigation. If today Ukraine is denied its right to free navigation, tomorrow it could be somebody else. So I think we have to be aware that this is not just about Ukraine, this is about all of us.
Now, this move comes after a tumultuous time in the DNR and the LNR this year. Would you say it's linked? Would you say that Russia is trying to secure some sort of corridors after it understood that its proxies in DNR and LNR are a bit uncontrollable?
Well, I think it's from their perspective, it's a natural progression. You've annexed Crimea, you want to annex the international waters around Crimea. I think it's linked to what's going on in the DNR and the LNR or the so-called DNR and LNR. I want to be very careful about that. Actually, I think it's if you really want to be accurate about in the illegally Russian-occupied areas of the Donbas, I think is the way we should begin to refer to these things. Language does indeed matter. But no, it's all part and parcel of a larger effort to destabilize Ukraine and to prevent Ukraine from taking the path that the Ukrainian people have chosen toward Euro-Atlantic integration. I think this is profoundly threatening to Russia, and they're going to use every weapon at their disposal in order to prevent this. So I think that what's going on in the Sea of Azov is part of that as well.
Now, there has been a lot of statements from the West, but few actions.
Yeah.
How do you explain, first, this lack of answer, and how can the West properly react?
Well, getting the West to act together, again, it's very difficult to get, 29 democratic countries to agree on something, right? So that's difficult to begin with. There is a reluctance to confront a nuclear-armed Russia that I think is natural. But then I think there's another thing that we need to start thinking very hard about, and that's that there's a lot of people in the West who want just to get back to business as usual with Russia. There's a lot of people making a lot of money from doing business with Russia. They want to get back to business as usual, and they see things like this incident in the Sea of Azov and the larger conflict around it as an irritant in that, and they would just prefer to move on. So I think this I think goes to kind of something that Russia has very effectively done, and that is create networks of influence in the West using weaponized corruption that creates networks of influence, that ties people makes them have an interest in having an accommodationalist approach toward Russia. And so when it commits aggression like this, it's going to have people in the West who at best are going to look the other way, but who also might even be openly supportive of what.
So you're saying that business as usual actually really blocks diplomatic efforts and in any ways to resolve the conflict.
Yes, and I think this goes to something that's, I mean, it's this very dangerous situation we find ourselves in right now. In the early 90s, I was one of the army of young people who came to the former Soviet Union. I worked in both Russia and Ukraine in those days. I worked in Odessa and St. Petersburg. And we truly believed, we're all working in the NGO sector and journalism and in other areas, we truly believed that the extent to which the Russian Federation was integrated with the West, they would begin to adopt Western norms and rules and modes of behavior. In fact, that hasn't happened. And what's happened, disturbingly, is that Russia has been able to export to the West a lot of its norms and modes of behavior, right? And this, again, this is what the Russian-born emigre political scientist Alina Ledeneva calls systema. This whole system of patronage and patron-client relationships and kleptocracy and corruption that permeated the entire Soviet Union, right? And this systema, if you will, survived the fall of communism, right? It continued. The Russians have a saying, "Systema остается." You know, the system remains. And so I think what we're seeing now, we're not in a Cold War per se, but we do have a struggle between two normative systems. A system to the West that is based on the rule of law, is based on transparency, accountability, the sanctity of contracts, all of these things we are taught from childhood in civics class that are important and indeed are important. And we have one to the East based on systema, based on patron-client relationships, kleptocracy, the subordination of the law to power, right? And these two systems are competing with each other, but unlike in the Cold War, when you had two kind of hermetically sealed systems, now the two systems are kind of integrated into each other. And this is creating a very dangerous situation because Russia has very effectively weaponized its capital in the West. So all of the Russian money sloshing around the city of London, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project in Germany, but these are just two of the most high-profile examples. There's a lot of dirty Russian money sloshing around the West, creating networks of influence, and I mean, I'm fond of saying effectively that corruption is the new communism in a lot of ways, because it's this trying to spread this kleptocratic system. Now, Ukraine is right on the front lines of this.
Which brings me to
Ukraine is
Ukraine.
West Germany, if you will, if you want to use the Cold War metaphor.
Which brings me to Ukraine. There is this systema existing still in Ukraine. How come some pro-Russian cronies like Medvedchuk, for example, are still in place?
Well, that's a question you need to ask your own prosecutors. but I mean, yes, they're still in place. But I think this is, and I know it's a very sensitive subject where you talk about the need to fight corruption in Ukraine. And I get this because it plays into this narrative that Moscow is trying to push that Ukraine's a failed state and Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt, which is funny having the Russians accusing
coming from Russia. It's, yeah, it's great.
But we'll leave that aside for a minute. But at the same time, I think we do need to focus on this. I think when we in the West do it, I think we have to bear in mind that we are part of the problem here too.
In which way?
Well, we're buying and selling Russian sovereign debt while all of this is going on. We're allowing corrupt Russian capital to move and infiltrate and infect and pollute Western financial systems. Mr. Putin did not invent money laundering. He didn't invent offshore. He didn't invent shell companies. We did that. But he's using all of these things to undermine the rule of law system that exists in the West and to spread systema, if you will.
So you would say the system founds a ground on capitalism system as the West created it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it finds a ground in these things are not necessarily part of capitalism. They don't have to be part of capitalism. I think one of the biggest things we need to do in the West to shore up our own defenses is to reform things like offshore. And money laundering certainly is illegal, but it goes on every single day. And so I think we have to, we have to be very vigilant about closing these loopholes in our system that have allowed so much dirty money to come in. Like I said, corruption is the new communism. And the Kremlin's black cash is the new red menace, right? Systema is the new Marxism-Leninism, if you will. So I think we have to start to think about it in those terms. But it's hard to get people to think about it in those terms in the West. It was easy to scare everybody about communism, right? If you go back to the beginning of the Cold War. And at the same time, communism, for all its faults, it kind of it appealed to like our higher aspirations and our higher ideals, even though in practice it was awful. Systema, corruption, plays on just a very base human instinct called greed, which is a very, very powerful human instinct. So I think it's very, very hard to get people to understand the threat of this. I mean, a lot of us are trying. I'm shouting it from the rooftops in Washington. And I think that the evidence bears it out. I mean, I just recently completed a study where I was looking at the available public data and statistics on corruption, organized crime, and the success of Russian malign influence operations, active measures, if you will. The success of Russian narratives, be they in disinformation or so on. And I looked at just two regions in Europe. I looked at the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and I looked at the four Visegrad states, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. And just looked and ranked each country according to the prevalence of organized crime. World Economic Forum has great data on this. The prevalence of corruption. Transparency International, of course, has great data on this. And then just looked at how successful Russian active measures were in these countries. And you almost had an exact correlation. The higher the corruption, the higher the organized crime. For example, in the Baltic states, Estonia is the least corrupt with the lowest organized crime and the lowest success of Russian active measures. Latvia is the highest in the Baltics, when the Baltic region is the best region in Europe, actually, on these matters. But within that region, Latvia had the most organized crime and the most corruption and the most success of Russian active measures. Similar pattern plays out in the Visegrad states as well. I'm beginning to expand this to look at the Black Sea region, right? To look at the littoral states of the Black Sea. I looked at Georgia, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Turkey. And again, Ukraine you have the highest prevalence of organized crime and the highest prevalence of corruption. Surprisingly, the Georgians are the lowest of the littoral states of the Black Sea. They actually score better than NATO and EU members, Bulgaria and Romania, and Turkey, NATO member Turkey. So I think, but I think this tells me that we have to pay attention to these things. These are security issues, and that this is a war of governance as much as it is a kinetic war, a shooting war.
Which brings me to my next question, the fact that some parts of populism, of far-right nationalism in Europe are directly linked to the Russian Federation. It is one of the other weapon,
yes,
let's say, that Russia uses against the West.
Yes. I mean, I think, again, if I can put this in, it's almost putting it in Marxian terms. But if you say the economic substructure of the Russian system is systema, there's also an ideological superstructure involved here. Now, in the former Soviet states, this is what became to be called the Ruski Mir, right? The so-called Russian world, right? In the West, it's playing on this populism. It's playing on this anti-globalization, and so it's appealing to the far left and the far right, because let's face it, if you have a choice between liberal democracy, with all its imperfections, and an authoritarian kleptocracy, what person with two brain cells to rub together of sound mind is going to say, oh yeah, I'd prefer to live in an authoritarian kleptocracy? Nobody's going to say that. So you have to sell something else to make Now this authoritarian kleptocracy is very, very attractive to elites. I mean, elites like this because, yeah, we're not going to bother you with any of that rule of law stuff the West bothers you with. Steal as much as you want, right? That's attractive to elites. Populations, not so much. So you have to sell the population something else. And you sell them Ruski Mir, or you sell them this anti-globalization, kind of anti-multiculturalism, anti-migrant, take what you will, whatever discontent you have with the current age. There was a white paper that came out of the Kremlin back in 2012, 2013 that advised that Putin exploit these divisions in Western society over things like globalization, multiculturalism, LGBT rights, what have you, in order to drive a wedge in these into Western society.
To find the cracks into
Western society. It's a classic, what we call a wedge issue, something that divides your opponent. So this is a clear strategy.
Now, that's about the West itself, and now I want to focus on the Balkans, because there is one front, let's say Russian front, that is being forgotten because of the Azov Sea, because of other events. I'm talking about Serbia and Kosovo here. And tensions are rising up again in the Balkans. How do you see this unfold?
Well, Russia's doing its best to exacerbate tensions in the Balkans. That's very clear. Interestingly enough, Serbia is not always a willing co-conspirator in this, because Serbia has its own game. Serbia has its own Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So what we're noticing Moscow doing is even going around Belgrade. So they have a kind of a direct line to the authorities in Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, where you're seeing like Dodik is not a client of Belgrade anymore; he's a client of Moscow. Right? And you're seeing the same dynamic develop in northern Kosovo, right? Because you're seeing Belgrade increasingly, and I'm not saying entirely, but increasingly trying to act like a responsible player in the region, because they do have Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So they're not a reliable Moscow client anymore, and Moscow's going around to whether it's in the RS or in northern Kosovo to kind of create problems. But Russia's doing its best to destabilize the Balkan region. I think this has been going on for a long time, and I think it's getting to a critical point now, where I think we're going to have a very big problem right in the heart of Europe again. And I think this is something we need to.
And we know where it's going afterwards.
Extremely aware of. Right?
Now, would you say that the theory submitted by Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard, that the one who controls Eurasia, because it's all about controlling certain fronts, the one who controls Eurasia now control the world, would you say it's still accurate today? Or it has, although the front line kind of expanded and changed?
By controlling Eurasia, what do we mean? What is control? I mean, I think that the chessboard has changed. I mean, I think I'm not a geographic determinist, if that's your question. I always find what Mr. Brzezinski has to say interesting and thought-provoking. Whether or not I agree with it 100% or not but I find it thought-provoking. But I think Eurasia is important, certainly. And I think what happens in Ukraine is extremely important. And all one has to do is to study the history of the Second World War to basically understand that. Every single Russian imperial project begins with Ukraine, but no Russian imperial project ends with Ukraine, right? So I think this is something we all need to be aware of. And when I say we are all Ukrainians, that is not just some line I throw out there because I'm going to get smiles in Kyiv. I say it because I believe it, and I think that what's happening here right now, if Russia is stopped in Ukraine, if Systema is stopped from spreading in Ukraine, if Russia's imperial ambitions are stopped in Ukraine, then there's actually hope that Russia can evolve into a more progressive direction and become a responsible member of the international community. But if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine one way or the other, then we're going to be dealing with a problematic Russia that's going to become a problem for the rest of Europe. And ask the Poles and the Czechs and the Romanians and the rest of Eastern Europe how if they have fond memories of Russian occupation. So.
And now, the main weapon, of course, in this Russia's war that Putin relies on is army. But the Russian economy is not that good, to say the least. is it sustainable to have such an army, such a
This is
huge
probably the question
logistic?
that we Russia watchers spend more time debating amongst ourselves in Washington. If I had a dollar for every time I had a conversation about this in a bar, I could retire tomorrow. I mean, what are we looking at? I mean, Russia has a GDP that is smaller than 4 U.S. states. Right? It's smaller than the state of California, Texas, and New York, and I forgot the fourth, but never mind. It's also smaller than New York City, right? Russia's GDP is smaller than the combined market capitalization of the top 3 U.S. companies, Google, Microsoft, and Apple, or Alphabet, Microsoft, and Apple, right? Now, how do you, if you look at it that way, it is unsustainable. It's completely unsustainable that you can put so much money into military, but yet they're continuing to do it. And they're continuing to basically deprive their population. And sooner or later, now how much patience, the legendary patience and tolerance for suffering that the Russian people allegedly have, we're going to see that right now. Because basically, the way I look at this is there's 3 big places that the money from the Russian budget has to go. It has to go to empire, that's your army. It has to go to kleptocracy, and that's important because that is all Putin has to keep the elite on his side, basically, is kleptocracy. You have to feed the kleptocracy, right? That's systema, right? And then the third is welfare. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a genius to figure out which of these 3 is going to be cutting as the Russian economy shrinks. It's going to be welfare. And so the big question is, how long do the Russian people put up with this? Right? The Soviet people put up with it for 70 years. Are these Russians different? Are these Russians who have had a taste of kind of being part of the global economy, do they want to give up their iPhones? Let's see. I don't know. I don't know. But one thing I think we need to do in the West is not make it so damn easy for them. Because what we've allowed right now is for Putin to have it both ways. He gets to enjoy the benefits of being part of the global economy and part of the international system, while at the same time trying to undermine the rules-based international system, right? He's benefiting from global commerce while undermining the free navigation of international waters, right? And I think we have to give Mr. Putin a clear choice here. If you want to behave like North Korea, then be North Korea, right? And I think we have to start thinking about things like, why are we buying and selling Russian sovereign debt? Should we be thinking about export restrictions, for example? During the Cold War, there was something called COCOM that forbade the sale of all dual-use technology, which is pretty much everything, to the Soviet Union or its allies. I mean, if we did this today, Silicon Valley would scream bloody murder because they're selling a lot of iPhones in Russia. It's a big market, right? But I think we have to start thinking in these terms, right? Stop letting them have it both ways. If you want to be a rogue, live like a rogue, and then let them make their choice then.
Which brings me to my last question of the interview. What, according to you, would be the weak points of Vladimir Putin right now? Which button can the West push for them, for these buttons to be efficient?
Well, this is where I just said we have allowed them to really have it both ways, like I said, and that's the weak point right there. I mean, effectively, Russia is it's an imperial kleptocracy, right? If this is the way to look at it, it's systema plus empire, right? And often this kleptocratic elements of the Russian state work hand in glove with the empire. For example, creating corrupt networks of influence through, by exporting corruption to Ukraine and farther west, right? That's one way that the kleptocratic and the imperial parts of the Putin state work in sync. But often they work at cross purposes, right? Kleptocracies are hungry. They require a lot of resources, and empires are expensive, right? So we have to start thinking about designing our policies to exploit this contradiction between these two things. And again, this goes back to me to this notion of not allowing them to have it both ways anymore. Because effectively you have The way I view the Putin regime, it's a crime syndicate masquerading as a state, right? And we shouldn't be letting crime syndicates into the G20 or into the WTO. We shouldn't be trading the sovereign debt of crime syndicates, right? We should not be allowing crime syndicates to have access to our financial institutions, right? And we have to start thinking about it like this. And I think that's the first step to undermining your weakness, saying, Mr. Putin, we recognize that you are a crime syndicate that's masquerading as a state. You're pretending you're a respectable state. We know you're not, and we're going to start treating you like a crime syndicate until you stop behaving like a crime syndicate. So if you want to be, again, you want to be North Korea, be North Korea. And that's Putin's weak point. Because if we treat him like what he is, then this regime will not survive.
Well, thank you very much for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. That was Brian Whitmore, Senior Fellow and Director at the Central for European Policy Analysis. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.